30 seconds, they say. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this GLOBSEC discussion on Year of 2020, Accelerated Path Towards Polarization. I'm Emily Tamkin. I'm the US editor at The New Statesman, and I am joined today by this very distinguished panel. We have Dominika Hajdu, Research Fellow of the Democracy and Resilience Program at GLOBSEC in Slovakia, Milan Nitsch, head of the Robert Bosch Center for Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia at the German Council of Foreign Relations in Germany, and Ambassador Norman Eisen, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute here in the United States. The way that the panel is going to work today, Dominika is going to start and give us a 5-minute presentation of the report. I'm then going to give both Milan and Ambassador Eisen 5 minutes to reply to anything that particularly struck them from the report or any areas where they're particularly concerned about polarization. After that, I will run about a 20-minute Q&A and then turn the questions over to you, the audience. So if you have a question and you put it in the chat, we'll spend the bulk of the panel on that, hopefully. So please do send in your questions. We only have 55 minutes left, so I'm going to run a tight ship. Dominika, 5 minutes to present the report, please.
Thank you. I'm on it and sharing the presentation now. Hope you can see it. So just to give you a very short overview, last week we've launched a report which is called GLOBSEC Trends, and it analyzes perceptions and attitudes of people in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Balkans towards a range of issues. We generally test the issues towards or the perceptions towards the European Union, NATO, US, Russia, China, but we also tested this year some attitudes towards obviously the COVID-19 pandemic and democracy and some polarizing narratives, which we believe are resonating in the society now. So I will just give you a very quick overview of some of the polarizing narratives that we found as resonating in the region. First of all, just to give you an idea, what is general support for democracy in the region? Most of the countries would be actually supportive of democracy, and but at the same time, in some countries, for example, Montenegro, Czechia, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, there is also a stronger support for a strong leader as well. When it came to polarizing narratives as such, we always try to test both the positive and sort of the negative part of that issue. And as you can see, while the support for democracy on the left side of the slide is prevalent in the region, at the same time, 41%, so that's between like 40 to 60, depending on the country, think that liberal democracy threatens their values and identity. And this is related to the part that liberalism now is often a label and a target of some of the divisive issues. Then the other thing that we tested was the so-called Western model, which is also often the target of hate and division. And again, as you can see, around 60% think that Western democracies like German or French democracies are better off when it comes to adhering to key democratic principles. But at the same time, sort of Western countries promote some morally corrupt decadent lifestyle. So again, are this threat to our democracy, to our values and identity. When it came to the European Union, for example, as you can see, in many countries, people would stay, or in case of the Western Balkans countries, they would join the European Union. But at the same time, many, from 1/3 to actually more than a half of the people, think that the EU is destroying their traditional values and identity. In Czechia and Serbia, it's actually more people say that the EU is destroying or would be destroying it in case of Serbia than those who would stay or join the EU. And the last topic I would emphasize is the topic of COVID-19, because I believe that this polarization might have also shifted to COVID-19 and topics related to the pandemic. And as you can see in the region, it's the beige colored bars. Not a majority of people in all of the countries would get vaccinated against COVID-19. The willingness to get vaccinated rises with the trust in public authorities, which maybe we can talk about later. But as you can see, on average, 36% only would get vaccinated. And there is also an increasing trust in or belief in some conspiracy theories which are related to COVID-19 disinformation, especially the one which doubts the authorities. So people think that the official number of COVID-19 cases is lower than public authorities tell us, and that COVID-19 is fake to manipulate the population. So this is just a glimpse of what the report offers us. I invite you to read it all, and thanks. I'm looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much for that presentation. There's certainly a lot to unpack in the rest of this discussion. Ambassador Eisen, we will start with you first. Was there anything, what about that report struck you about the report in particular? And then more generally, what are the areas where you're increasingly wary of polarization? You're on mute.
There, now I'm off mute. Thanks, Emily, for hosting today. And it's an honor to be here with Milan and Dominika, and of course to participate with our friends at GLOBSEC, both when I served in the region as an ambassador of the United States in Prague, and now as a fellow at Brookings and the co-chair of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. We prize GLOBSEC's activities for just the reasons that this poll illustrate, both in guiding us as to what's really happening on the ground in Europe, and in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, and pointing to what's needed to address the situation, including with critical issues like democracy and polarization. To turn to your question, on the plus side, I was encouraged by the overwhelming numbers of respondents who agreed that democracy was good for their countries, 90% in Slovakia, 86% in Poland. Support for the EU has increased overall by 9 points since 2018, and NATO up by 5 points from 2018. I view all of those post-World War II institutions in which the transatlantic democracy is so rooted as antidotes to polarization. The same is true of multilateralism. And I can't help but note that on the COVID point, 82% of all respondents said that they think that international cooperation is important to confronting the COVID-19 crisis. That being said, there were some concerning indicators in the numbers. In the Czech Republic and Bulgaria, declined for support in the EU by 15 and 7 points respectively over the past 3 years. Declining support for NATO in both of those countries, 9% in Bulgaria and 11% in the Czech Republic. And more generally, 4 out of 10 people living in NATO member countries who now believe that NATO is a tool of US aggression and intentionally provokes Russia. Of course, the role of Russian instigation and disinformation and accelerating polarization, not just in Europe, but in the United States, has been well documented. History will not soon forget that behavior in 2016. For example, on the whole, there is no escaping from the reality that we're living in a highly polarized age. It's an acceleration of trends that in retrospect we saw starting in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, with the absence of that framing conflict opening up a Pandora's box. I would be remiss if I did not spend at least a half of the minute remaining to me talking about the situation in the United States, the other anchor of the transatlantic alliance that's so critical to democracy around the world, where we find ourselves in a highly polarized age. But as I've often written, I am an optimist that these polarizations will be overcome, and I do not think in our own domestic political situation that not only would I say the glass is half full rather than half empty, I would say it's 3/4 full. The center is held in the United States. We came through an incredible attempt, and it's mirrored. Just today, we have more bad news out of Hungary. So Trump's behavior is mirrored by the Orbáns and the Putins of the world. And yet the United States has come through it. Our institutions have proven strong, and the efforts to use polarization to really drive a wedge in our democracy have failed. Our electoral college has met yesterday, and the system has held. So I think that tells an optimistic long-term story about the strength of democratic institutions. So I come away from the GLOBSEC report with some positive indicators, some continuing signs of trouble, and a renewed determination to keep fighting, including with our friends at GLOBSEC, to shed light on these trends and advance democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. And don't worry, we'll come back to you for more on the US, I'm sure, over the course of the next however long we have. Milan, do you share that optimism when you look at the report, or caveated optimism?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be with former colleagues from GLOBSEC. It's an excellent report. Congratulations and great work. Also graphically, it's very nice to see on the screen. I wish I could print it, but now we are on home office. That's not always possible. Thank you, Emily, also for hosting. And of course, I shared some parts of optimism that Ambassador Eisen expressed. Overall, one of my takeaways is that there is this is a testimony to a surprising resilience of many societies across Central and Eastern Europe. But it also makes sense to underline that this region is not a monolith. These 9 countries are quite different universe. GLOBSEC selected 4 Visegrad countries plus Romania and Bulgaria, so 6 EU members. Then 3 Balkan countries, Serbia, Montenegro, and Northern Macedonia, out of which 2 last ones are NATO members. If you look across the spectrum, so from Prague all the way down to Skopje, I see 2 outliers. One is Serbia, which across the board on geopolitics, conspiracy theories, and so on, is really very much under the spell of its president leader Vučić and looking to China and not believing the West. This is also a reminder that some of these countries had a very particular recent history and they have their geography. So Serbia has lost several wars after the end of Yugoslavia towards NATO and the West, and it's still very much shaping the public opinion, and through the ethnic factor in Montenegro as well. The other outlier is Hungary, but I think this is a positive news from your report, Dominika, about the Hungarian society and the backlash towards where the Orbán's government is leading the country. So as Hungary is preparing for elections in spring 2022, this report, and we can come back to details, but this report gives me more hope, actually. in terms of conspiracy theories and vaccination, if you compare it to Western Europe, this is not such a big shock. You have about 40% of French citizens doubting about vaccination in France. So you have maybe different scale in some of these countries, but not so much. Where Central and Eastern Europe is more specific is the cultural and identity issues connected to anti-COVID or to backlash against COVID and the whole thinking about it. This was for me the most fascinating part of your research survey and report on the identity where liberal democracy or European Union is perceived as a threat to national culture and identity. Some countries again jumped up out of it. I'm sure we can come back to the Czech case, Bulgarian case, Hungarian case, and others. China is not there, with the exception of Czech Republic and Serbia. Czech Republic very well aware of the Chinese threat because of what was happening in the last 2 years in domestic politics, and also Serbia as the most pro-China, China-friendly society. But overall, China is not there in the discourse. It's not perceived as an important factor at the time when the incoming Biden administration will try to revive the US, the transatlantic relations also about China. And the EU, in general, I think good picture. You have overall support in the member states very high. Also surprising support among many respondents of Central and Eastern European countries to act as a unified bloc on the world stage. So this is against where some leaders are moving their countries as veto players, Hungary and Poland most recently. At the same time, still the long shadow of Russia in some countries and societies that see Russia as ally, and of course this is connected to histories in Slovakia, Bulgaria. Interestingly enough, in Hungary only down to 33%. So when we unpack, I think this is societies in general, but when you put it together with elites and with political elites, it's very important how these perceptions are shaped then from the side of governments, leaders, and the media. And one thing we cannot factor is actually very different media situation across these 9 countries. In some countries, you have complete media plurality, and in some, like in Hungary and Serbia, you have very controlled space.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go now to Dominika, but when I'm done with her, I'm coming back to Ambassador Eisen to ask how you see polarization as manifesting itself differently in the US and the European Union. So think about that while I question Dominika. Dominika, both Ambassador Eisen and Milan got to speak a bit about what surprised them from the report. And since it's your report, I wanted to ask if there was anything when the responses came in that you thought was surprising, or that is maybe markedly different from your expectations based on past years.
Mm-hmm. So what surprised me the most is one thing is that already Milan mentioned, and that's this dichotomy between a general support for democracy, for the EU, but then, the constant feeling of being under threat when it comes to identity and values. And this is something I find very dangerous because it can be exploited very easily. And a lot of narratives can be built upon that. And this is, it's basically prevalent between 30 to 50% of the respondents in each country. And actually in other polling that we did in March, we also found out that the majority of people in Central Europe would be also willing to give up their basic rights and freedoms for other benefits, such as higher financial security or higher security in their country overall. So this constant feeling of being under threat, I think, is present here, and it might be linked to different developments in the world, to, I don't know, globalization, to the internet full of information through which where it's difficult to navigate. But there are some fears, I think, which are hidden here, which are really worth exploiting further.
Thank you. One thing that you just mentioned, which is this kind of, I want to say politics of grievance, right? This belief that your culture is under attack is one thing that I think we also see here in the United States in some portions of the population. But as I am but the moderator and not a panelist, rather than continuing that thought, I'll turn back to Ambassador Eisen. Ambassador, where do you see, I think very often we speak about, oh, these countries are so polarized, and whatever country you're in, you then fill in the gaps, right? It's like, oh, it's polarized here this way, and thus it must be polarized the same way in Czech or in Hungary or in Slovakia, et cetera. But, you know, you spent large amounts of time in the region, you work on transatlantic relations. How do you see it as similar or different here and there?
Well, I'll start with polarization in the U.S. and note some points of comparison and difference in Europe. In the United States, we have the same the locus of polarization often focuses on federal versus state issues, on the role of the federal government, the place of the federal government, and that of the states. That's been a persistent strain, and some would argue not the exclusive, but the dominant or a dominant theme of American polarization since the founding of our country. In the debate between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists about states' rights versus the need for a strong national government. And it continues, it led to the Civil War in the United States in the context of slavery. And, you know, many of us feel that we haven't made that much progress in resolving hostilities between North and South since 1865. European attempts at multilateral institutions or transnational institutions like the EU and NATO, with the support of the United States in the former and the active participation of the United States in the latter, have a similar, serve in a similar fashion as a locus for polarized beliefs. So the extreme individual beliefs, say around the vaccine, both in our country and in Europe, do have an association with the resistance to those transnational mechanisms in Europe and federalism in the United States. That's point one. Point two, I think you can find an association between these polarized beliefs and some of the hardest hit. The Central and Eastern Europe is still in a still healing the wounds of the prior century. I know this from my personal experience, not only from the data, that you know, those dislocations and grievances are still fresh in the United States. A lot of the polarization that we see is among those who've been very hard hit economically. And if you look at the EU transfer payments, you have a sense of similar economic dislocation in Europe. And then finally, I would not ignore the role of those of external actors who seek to exacerbate the differences between us. I've already talked about Russia. So those are 3 points of comparison and difference. I never ever, when I see the Europe's resistance to the EU manifested in Brexit or in the current battle that we've just overcome between Poland and Hungary on the one hand, and the rest of the EU on the other, about rule of law protections and budgeting. I always, the struggles of those at the state level in the United States who resist attempts at progress on the federal level come to mind.
It's a great point, and thank you for raising it. I do want to speak specifically about COVID. But first, I want to remind our audience, look, I have never been to a GLOBSEC event where there weren't questions. So I will once again ask you to please put them in the chat box so that I can bring them into the last third, my math was right, of this panel. But first, Milan, as you were wrapping up your opening remarks, you mentioned the media. As a journalist, I'm biased about our own importance, but could you speak a bit more about the role because I do think this is relevant in particular to information and misinformation around the pandemic. So Milan, if you could speak a bit about some of the differences that you see in the situation of the media in these different countries and why it matters and what can be done about it.
I wish I know the answer to your last part of your question, what could be done about it? But let's not forget that some countries like Serbia has had this government-controlled media situation for a decade. And then when you read the data from this survey, it copies the official narrative to a large extent. When I mentioned that Serbia is an outlier on China, then it can be also connected with the longer identification. This is the Titoist foreign policy back in the 80s, with which a lot of society identified, was also sort of balancing between many powers. But if you have sort of 60% identifying with China as a main strategic ally, it's what is being projected by the ruling party and the leader, and the media sort of repeating it. The same about the West or liberalism as a threat to national culture. It's something as imposed. And then you have situation, for instance, in very open countries where media is not so much controlled, although they are very polarized, like in Poland. And then you have the picture is much more diverse. So you don't have, if you look at what the government is saying on some of these issues, including LGBT rights and so on, society is actually split, but it's more polarized. It's not so, you don't have this dominant opinion there. And Hungary, again, I mentioned it was fascinating for me because there's another country where media, especially in the last 2 years, were under government control and oligarchs linked to government control. On where Hungary belongs between East and West, you have this drop of belonging to the West to 37%, and proponents of seeing their own country, Hungary, between East and West went up to 56%. But also you have a backlash to what the government is saying on Europe, on European Union, and on minority rights, minority meaning especially the LGBT. Hungary is a surprisingly sort of culturally open society in this. So it goes both ways. And I think that there are also other things that come to shaping the perceptions on societies. Let's not forget that some of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe have had a long crisis ever since 2008. It started as a financial crisis. They were hit very much, especially in the Balkans, but also in Hungary. And that they have not recovered, or they have been also populist governments for the last almost a decade. So what you have at the end of a decade, opinions in societies. It's something else when you have change of governments in some of these countries, like in Poland, like in Slovakia, and then Czech Republic, where Ambassador Eisen served. Not big surprises. For instance, that the Czech society came up as the most Eurosceptic, 56% adopting the EU, and the EU behavior as EU institutions not actually performing very well at the beginning of the pandemics. They just, I think, reinforce the old Czech feeling, like we are in the middle of this mountains, fine, and we should be left alone. We belong to Europe, but not too much. So it's there. It would be interesting to compare it with actually trends, with other GLOBSEC trends from previous years. I'm sure the whole team at GLOBSEC will produce something like that, and then we could see what this year, where we had the most sort of counter intuitive results.
We're getting audience questions that I will turn to in just a moment. Before I do, Dominika, I want to ask you, one of your key findings, and if it looks like I'm reading this, it's because I am, is that trust in public authorities corresponds with people's willingness to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Only 37% of respondents are inclined to get the vaccine, but if you go to people who trust public authorities, that number rises to 53%. I'm working on a piece on this today, so apologies for it's on my mind. In the US, there is a subset of people who are just opposed to vaccines, who you're going to have a difficult time reaching. There are more broadly people who are skeptical about this vaccine because even though it was properly, they have been properly tested, they have gone through this very rigorous number of trials, they're worried because it's coming out faster. Is there a similar skepticism of vaccines generally in Central and Eastern Europe, or I guess, how do you separate fear about this one particular vaccine, which can be countered with information and facts, with just skepticism of authorities more broadly?
So I think there are two things to that. One is the generally lower trust in authorities and generally lower satisfaction with democracy in this region than in Western Europe and also the United States. And this is also then quite nicely shown on the willingness to get vaccinated in Western Europe, which is still higher than in the CEE region. This is one thing. The other thing is that, yes, the general skepticism towards vaccines is lower than towards this particular vaccine. Also because here there are prevalent doubts about the fact that you mentioned, that how is it possible that it's been so quick? How is it possible that we've tested within 1 year, and that it's probably some pharma lobby. What we're missing here, I think, is very diligent and strategic communication about vaccination. In Slovakia, also in Romania and some other countries, at the same time, there have been increasing anti-vax groups, which are appearing on the scene, which have been largely ignored for the past years. And eventually, in 2018, we had cases of Romanians dying from measles, a disease which we thought was cured already, had been cured. So this is definitely also one of the factors, the strong anti-vax lobby, sort of, which hasn't been countered by some coordinated response in the past years, which would be actually communicating the importance of this one. And obviously, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were also other issues to solve, and there are still other issues to solve. But within the strategic communication, I see it's still lacking. And actually, to the contrary, we see, because the vaccine is becoming also a bit of a polarizing issue, and people don't trust it that much. We are seeing some political representatives, having very careful statements about the fact whether they would get vaccinated, and about whether they would actually recommend the vaccination to others. So because of this lack of trust, we're seeing some political representatives actually, going with the flow and being careful about that.
If I may, I think this is a real risk that in some of the Central and Eastern European countries, part of the political mainstream would shift to the anti-vaccination platform because it pays off. So far, there has been, these people that are protesting also here in Berlin, in Germany. It's quite a strong, surprisingly strong sort of anti-vaccination movement, but they stay at the far right. They are seen as extremists. But in some Central and Eastern European countries, because they are becoming, as well, Dominika, as you said, 1/3 of the society to 1/2, it's very attractive to the mainstream opposition to join up with them, which is happening now in Slovakia, for instance.
Okay, I'd like to now bring in the audience. So our first question, and any one of you can answer any of these, although I might suggest that somebody starts off. We have, what would be the advice you would give the Biden administration in dealing and establishing relations with Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkan countries? What can we expect from this new Biden administration, and will it be different from Trump's? How? Ambassador Eisen, I will let you start with that. You have to unmute yourself first, though.
Forgive me. I would advise that we re-engage from a posture of alliances. The idea of America first is, and the outgoing President Trump's distortions of, for example, the 2% defense spending targets, 2% of GDP target, as a debt to be paid. Those distorted and, in my view, un-American values and empirical lies need to be corrected by a return to a posture of alliance, which is one of mutual reliance, of encouraging full achieving the 2% target as a matter of our mutual safety and security. So that would be the first point. The second would be to address these individual bilateral relationships in the multilateral context. So as part of a re-embrace of multilateralism. And the third would be to stress that our shared values, and in particular those around the functioning of democracy, are serve to unify us, and to really stress that values-based theme of U.S. foreign policy, which has been missing. I think we need to talk to our Central and European and Eastern European allies about what steps we're going to take to make sure that democracy continues in the United States, continues, including in its relationships with Europe, continues the track that prevailed, in my view, from, let us say, 1942 to 2016, and not the path of the past 4 years. So we need to be honest about what we're going to do internally. That's the fourth and final point, to rescue our democracy from these dislocations and make us a more reliable ally.
I would start by saying that we need to remind ourselves in Europe that Biden administration will start in a very, very difficult domestic situation in the US with a lot of domestic challenges, and it will take time when the president could put a full weight, political weight behind some of the initiatives, and therefore Washington DC will be waiting for initiatives from Europe as well. So some of the answer to your question will come through European level for these countries and government. But I would expect from the Biden administration to lead by example, to provide more clarity and return the US into the multilateral framework. Then on geopolitics, very clearly again come back to push away some Russian narratives and Russian influence as the yesterday's issue, which is still present with us, but also on China and on some of the regulatory wars, digital and also benign influences. And then on COVID, this will be a big change. It's a huge global challenge which is staying. Sometimes when we discuss the whole COVID issue, also in this context of your report, we forget that this is not over. You know, maybe we are in the middle of it. Final thing, there was a tendency under the Trump administration to somehow capitalize on very strong transatlantic sentiment in Poland, the Baltic countries, and sort of play with them vis-a-vis Western Europe. I think this is now over, and the Biden administration will look to Europe as a partner, and in the interest of the US would be to have a strong European position.
I'm going to break up the next two questions differently than, there's part of one that goes with the other, so apologies to Daniel Milo who sent it in. But the first part of his question is, how do you see the image and the role of the US in Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans changing under the new administration? So this goes to what you were just talking about with how the Trump administration kind of, I wouldn't say courted, but you know, presented itself as seeing eye to eye with some Central and Eastern European countries, while taking a more adversarial stance towards some Western European countries. How do you think the US will be perceived in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans under Biden?
Look, this survey confirms that there are two societies with seeing US as the number one strategic ally, which is Poland and Romania. In Poland, the current government, peace government, will have an issue at the beginning as the government and President Duda very much allied with President Trump. And also there might be certain vocal criticism on democracy and values and rule of law issues from Washington. But overall, you know, Poland will stay very much in this camp, hoping to revive transatlantic relations with the Biden administration. It will be interesting how Biden administration will play in the Balkans. The Trump administration was disengaging from that region, with the exception of Serbia. Maybe there was an interesting realignment with Belgrade. So Serbia-Kosovo issue is there as a leftover. Let me use this opportunity to highlight Northern Macedonia as a society that was so much, it was so difficult year for that small country, refused twice by the European Union as on top of pandemics. So here, US could really help. It's also in the NATO context, and Montenegro has new government. So there are things where Europe and US together could do more things. And in Montenegro, position on NATO membership is half-half, and maybe this new government will stabilize it, and Biden administration could help in this, or you would have even more polarized picture.
Does anyone else want to add to how the image of the US will change in Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans?
Sorry, I forgot to mention Hungary. Yes. And Viktor Orban, of course. That's an interesting situation. Yeah, with I think that's one thing to watch, because the society is more, I think it's following Viktor Orban in this shift towards the east, in China and Russia as allies. So much Russia, 3%, but at the same time, I think they would be open to some new tone from Washington.
I would maybe add, if I may, yeah. In terms of, I mean, it of course depends on what the Biden administration does in the region, right? So if there are some clear signals on towards the CEE and towards the Western Balkans that they're actually a partner, that we actually have some joint initiatives that and the US can be a partner we can count on, and they continue sending clear messaging to the region, which has been missing for the past 4 years. Its perception in the region can be better in a way that, you know, up until now, and in many countries as well, the US is seen as a threat because people are still, you know, perceiving the US within its more aggressive policies or aggressive politics. Of course, in the Balkans, that's, you know, the end of the past century, but still people are perceiving the US in a more militaristic way in the region. This is what we have from our polls. So, you know, if there was more coordination on a bilateral and multilateral basis and signs such as the Paris Climate Agreement, I think, you know, the new administration has the potential of actually shifting the image of the US as a partner, not as like sort of a power which is patronizing, which has some patronizing behavior towards the region.
Okay, well, Milan mentioned Russia and China, and actually we've all been, well, not me, but you've all been bringing up Russia and China throughout this conversation. We have 2 questions on it. So part of the question I just asked was that it's evident that the vacuum left by the US is being filled by China and Russia, and their footprint is increasing. And we also got a question that reads, what should the European Union and the United States do in order to limit the foreign influence of Russia and China in the Western Balkan countries? So now we will dive in the last 10 minutes into the issue of Russia and China. Ambassador, I'll start with you.
Number one, we need to reaffirm for all the ambivalence that the world has about it, the clear American commitment to a principled alternative, including values-based multilateral institutions as an alternative to the Russian or Chinese opportunities for alliance or connection. That choice was, that's a complicated picture, and Milan's reference to the historical legacies in the Balkans are a good example of it. It's been my experience, however, my personal experience, and I think the data in the latest GLOBSEC survey reflects this, that there are opportunities for that kind of leadership. Number two, we need to, in a targeted way, we cannot do this for the entire world, but I do think with Europe, we need to find ways to offer alternatives to the economic incentives that in particular China dangles. They're not actually attractive in the long term. They come with strings attached and other complications. We need to be more intentional in our economic diplomacy. And then number three, I think we need to, and this applies to both Russia and China, it's the bookend to that affirmative vision of American leadership that I started with. I think we need to be much more blunt in calling out the behavior of those and other totalitarian states or totalitarian leaning states. I mean, the incredible, how can we do business as normal with China when they're putting Uyghurs in concentration camps? So we need to return to a strong and principled advocacy, including criticism of the immoral dimensions of those two competing regimes.
I would say the battlegrounds are Montenegro and Northern Macedonia. I think US will be better served not to come from a moral height standpoint, but rather engage on economic issues and talk to societies through their embassies. And this is very much the next decade is we can lose the Western Balkans geopolitically, I'm afraid, if Europe and the US will not re-engage in an effective way. And I deal with Ukraine and Moldova and other countries as well, and I could see that at least there you have the debate. It's very clear what Russia is doing there. You have China coming. Debate in the Balkans is not so much on the edge, and I think there is a lot of explaining what is China after if they invest into highways in Montenegro across the country with their own standards, and then you have state budget relying on that. So it's there are open debates where arguments need to be pursued also from the US side. The US was not so present in the last period, and it was felt.
I would maybe add that also the US and the EU especially also need to step up the fight in the information war, which Russia is openly waging, and it has been influencing the societies. And our polls show that people there are not at all familiar or aware of the help the EU has given to Western Balkans, right? Everyone thinks it's only China and Russia because they advertise it well, and the EU doesn't advertise it at all. So it's also the information and the advertising of the actions and the support those states are given to those countries should be stepped up definitely.
Oh, okay. We have one last question. Well, we have time for one last question. And fortunately, we only have one last question. And it is a controversial one. If President Biden or Vice President Harris were to come to Central Europe, which country should they travel to and why? Where would their visit be the most important? So at the risk of asking you to choose a favorite, we'll go Ambassador Milan Dominica.
Well, I think they should go pick when I was in the Obama administration, I traveled with the president before I was ambassador when I was working in the White House to Prague for the signing of the arms control treaty with Russia, and the leaders of the region converged. So I think that I know this is a cheating answer to a tough question, but because you can only visit so many places, what I really think you need to do is pick one, maybe two places to visit. And I suppose that they're contiguous. It does show my favoritism, but I would pick one kind of from the good column and one from the challenging column. So I might pair a visit to, I mean, it's so predictable for me to say Prague, but I might pair a visit to Prague or Bratislava for a summit where you bring in the leaders of the region with a visit to Poland, both to embrace the aspects of the alliance that are strong, but to put some pretty blunt pressure on the Poles not to go the way of Hungary. And I believe I certainly agree on some of the neglected geographical priorities that Milan raised in his answer to the last two questions. But I think the single most pressing issue from a democracy standpoint in the region is to keep the Poles from going the way of Hungary with these. And the EU is not going to be able, they've demonstrated with their latest cave and the predisposition for consensual decision-making that is part of the DNA of the EU, that they cannot do that alone. So I think to deliver some strong medicine and to really have a plan to hang on to Poland is absolutely critical.
Okay, so Prague and maybe Warsaw. Milan, where would you send them?
I subscribe to this. I think you cannot avoid, President Biden cannot avoid Poland. This is where his predecessor visited. As a matter of fact, I think President Duda already invited him. And then it's, I would pick up countries where you have, where if you look at the GLOBSEC trends, where you have polarization, it's not, something is going on. I was struck by Romania, how much open it is. Very difficult situation also in Bulgaria, where Europe, the drop to the criticism of Europe there and drop 15 or 13 percentage point is due to the fact that the EU institutional elites are seen as shining away the prime minister and the corrupted government. So anywhere else, I would say Poland plus anywhere else where the US president's visit could make the case.
Okay, and Dominika, as you know, as a report's author, we'll give you the last word.
Thank you very much. I would also argue with Poland just because I believe it's most important to them. Also from what we see in polls. And second, I would suggest Bratislava, exactly, not only because I'm from Slovakia, but mostly because on the contrary, Slovaks tend to be the least pro-US in the region. So to show them also some kind of a sign that they're important partner as well.
Okay, it is exactly 10:30, so that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to all of you who took an hour of your day to tune in. Please do read the report in full. Thank you to GLOBSEC for organizing this event, and thank you to our panelists, Dominika Hajdu, Milan Nič, and Ambassador Norman Eisen. All right, take care, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
And stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.